Hello and welcome to EDHREC's Upping the Average, where we take a commander's average decklist as compiled by the data on EDHREC and make some swaps to it to help take it from a good start to a great one. For this installment, we've got nearly everything we need, but I think we're still missing something. Let's see, we've got his sword and his bow and, yes, and my axe. Torbran, Thane of Redfell is a 4-mana 2/4 dwarf noble with a simple but powerful line of text. Whenever our red sources deal damage to an enemy or something they control, that damage is amplified by 2. This even means that he hits for 4 damage in combat instead of just 2 damage. Torbran's page is nasty. He turns a single ping into a lightning bolt, which means we want to be pinging people a lot. Don't expect games to last a long time when Torbran's around. Let's see what this noble is up to by taking his average deck list from the average deck feature and importing it into the Architect's deck building website. Remember that, as always, any swaps we make must either be cost neutral or help lower the price of the overall list. Yeah, this list is sick. Torbran can be a fast deck, but it's not uncomfortably fast. There are some mono-red commanders out there like Perforos or Krenko who can end the game so quickly that it can feel to opponents like they never got a full chance to play. I feel like Torbran does a good job of riding that line though, punishing enemies who think that they'll have a long time to set up, but not ending the game before it can begin. We should be very attentive to the mana curve here though. There are almost no cards that cost 6 or more mana, and very few that even cost 5. We're not looking for burst damage either, but lots of individual pings. A card that deals 6 damage to an opponent when mathed out by Torbran would deal less damage overall than a card that deals 1 damage to opponents 3 times, because Torbran will amplify each instance separately, giving us more bang for our buck. In the classic mono-red way, this video is not going to be a long one. I've only got a few swaps I want to make, and we'll do them in the following ways. First, we'll pay attention to the deck's consistency. Next, we'll warm ourselves up by the hearth. And finally, we'll get a little bit clever. Let's start off with part 1. How can we make this deck a little bit more consistent? Mono-red is explosive, but it is also sometimes therefore a bit swingy. It is definitely capable of some huge kabooms, but it also runs the risk of sputtering out. There are 2 ways that we can fight against this. One is by cutting some of the higher mana cost cards, and the other is by having more card advantage. There's a lot to praise here. Fiery Confluence deals multiple instances of damage, dishing out 3 waves of 4 damage each when Torbran's in play. Mana Barbs means any opponent casting even a 3-mana Rhystic Study will take 9 damage. And don't even get me started on Pyrohemia. Still, there is something kinda lacking here. The first thing that really strikes me is how little card advantage this deck contains. It is supposed to be a faster deck, but I really am concerned about our ability to eke out those final points of damage before we run out of steam. I want to make room for a few extra card advantage effects in the deck, but I'm gonna have to cut some weird cards to do it. We have a handful of cool creatures that ping our enemies incrementally, and I love every one of them, but I sadly can't dish out a ton of love for Brash Taunter here. I want to be clear, I adore the crap out of this card, but in this deck, it is just a little bit too slow. It's at the top of our curve, it takes a turn to use the ability, and even though it absorbs damage like a champion, it's only dealing damage back to a single opponent. This is a cool card. I just think there's a few too many speed bumps, especially considering the mana cost, for it to be as cool as it could be in this particular deck. I'm also looking through the Planeswalkers, and I'm really sorry to report that I don't think some of these make the cut either. Chandra's ability doesn't feel impactful enough to me, and Jaya is 5 mana for a very killable Planeswalker. And it's all just to get an additional 1 point of damage on our effects. Our deck has enough trouble keeping Torbran alive, let alone keeping alive an attackable Jaya. And on the subject of amplifying damage, I also have some extremely bitter news to report. Damage doubling effects, such as Dictate of the Twin Gods, do not stack nicely with Torbran. It's weird, but it's true. Our opponents get the choice of which effect will hold first. So instead of us dealing 1 damage, which Torbran would then amp to 3, and then which would get doubled by the Dictate to 6, it actually ends up being the case that we would deal 1 damage, and Dictate would double it to 2, and then Torbran amplifies it to 4. Opponents get the choice of which damage amplification to layer first. I'll totally understand folks who still think the Dictate is worth the inclusion here, but for me, that rules interaction breaks my heart just too much. This is a symmetrical effect that, for our deck, is quite literally the top of our curve, and given just how many tiny 1 damage pings we're packing, I feel that it mostly just takes our 1 damage to 2 damage, which I'm not sure is worth the mana or the risk of enemies taking advantage of it too. As for replacements, these are my proposed inclusions. We have an Endless Atlas in the list already, and a Maze Mine Tome I think will join it very happily. I also quite like Tectonic Reformation here. If we're top decking and we need anything but lands, this card can help us filter down to find the damage spells that we need. And finally, since we're doing so much damage, I really like the light up the stage as well. Let's just say it's very unlikely that we'll ever play this without the spectacle cost. But even if we do, it's still pretty solid. That does it for Section 1. Like I said, this one's going to be pretty quick and easy. Let's hustle on into Section 2. We're not just here to get warm and toasty, we're here to add fuel to the fire. But we can't stay too long, because if we linger, we're gonna get burned. Let's talk about a couple of other waves of damage that our friend can enhance. Our goal here is just to address some of the damage removal we've got for enemy creatures. Some of these effects are quite cool, and even the small ones aren't that small when Torbran's around. There are 2 overload spells that make me raise an eyebrow though. Electrickery I almost like. It's 2 mana to ping every enemy creature for 3 damage when Torbran's around. And then Mizzium Mortars, when overloaded, will be 6 mana to deal even more damage. There's nothing wrong with these in the traditional sense, I guess, but it is important that they, A, won't kill every enemy creature, and B, won't do as much without our commander around. And I don't know about you, but commander-dependent removal, it feels a little bit iffy to me. So here are my proposed alternatives. We have an Earthquake in the list already, so how about adding in its cousin, the Rolling Earthquake? This hits flying creatures, but also their owners. This can make hay with the battlefield while also melting life totals. And while we're at it, let's get cheeky. I'm really intrigued by the card Flame Break here. 3 damage to everything and everyone, sans flying, and for our enemies, that 3 becomes 5. But that means this spell doesn't kill our own commander. And we get to do both things at once. Unlike the spells we just cut, we're hitting not just creatures, but players too. And continuing on that line of thought, I really do feel that enemy life totals are our most important target here. As they say, our best form of creature removal is player removal. So in honor of cards like Price of Progress and other one-time kaboom spells that already show up in the list, let's also throw in Acidic Soil. It's just a solid amount of damage that will affect our opponents more than it will affect us, given how low our curve is and how few lands we'll probably have in play compared to them, but also it scales appropriately as the game goes on. Plus, it punishes the heck out of 2 eager, rampy opponents. Oh, that's a nice landfall deck you've got there. Would be a shame if something were to happen to it. This is just a hardy damage spell that I don't think most opponents will see coming. We're moving at a really good pace, but maybe we should slow down a little bit. We don't want to throw our time around willy-nilly, and after all, nobody tosses a dwarf. Let's finish up with our final section. It's time to get clever. Don't tell the elf, but our noble friend here may have learned a thing or two on his travels, and he's got some clever tricks that he can pull out against people who think they've already got him figured out. First, before I forget, there's a Valakut here, so we don't want to be displacing our mountains too much. But can we still get a Dwarven Mine in here anyways? It's also a mountain, and it makes a blocker, or a red creature that Torbran will amplify to deal a little bit of extra damage too. I don't know, I just think it's funny here, and it doesn't have all that much opportunity cost. Hi-ho. Next, let's talk about this here Nyx Lotus. 4 mana to later ramp us for our devotion to red. There's not a lot of nice things I have to say about this one. Like, there's synergy here. Torbran has 3 red pips, after all. But this mana rock is very, very inconsistent in my experience, and it feels like it requires much more permanent sources of devotion to make it happy. This taps for a decent amount when our commander is in play, but we usually need our mana rocks to be the thing that lets us play our commander in the first place. I'm just off it. I don't think our deck has the patience for this thing. The swap I'm going to recommend here is in honor of games I've played against the godfather of EDH. I'm inspired by the Tybalt's trickery in the main board, and I feel that we need more clever interaction against those pesky blue players. So take your pick of Pyroblast or Red Elemental Blast. When I play mono red, either one of these feels like an absolute gem. Killing off Muldrothas, countering Sheldon Menery's villainous wells, it's just a great time. This isn't good against every single opponent out there, but I also literally cannot remember the last time I saw a table that didn't contain any blue at all. The official inclusion here will be the Red Elemental Blast, because it is far cheaper in its old frame printing. But I do personally prefer the Pyroblast since it can be cast even if there's nothing blue in play or on the stack, and it can trigger some of our cards that deal damage whenever we cast instants and sorceries. Give one of these a shot. This is the type of thing that opponents will not expect, and that's the type of cockiness that Torbran loves to take advantage of. Finally, Leyline of Combustion does not impress me. For 4 mana, I wish it did more. It lightly disincentivizes our opponents from removing Torbran by threatening to deal 4 damage to them if they target him. I just don't like that, though. It's not damage that we're in control of, for one, and it's damage that only gets targeted at one opponent for another. I just don't think that that's really proper protection. And besides, if we're going to deal damage to only one opponent, I would so much rather that it be a wild time. Say by replacing this card with the one and only Mana Clash. This thing is bizarre, but hear me out. If we do this coin flipping dance, we might take one every so often, but whomever we target will take 3 damage every time they lose. This is technically risky, but we've stacked the odds. If we lose 3 flips and an opponent loses 3 flips, we take 3, but they take 9. It could do nothing, it's true, but it also could be lethal. And all of that for just 1 mana, I'm totally in. I'll finish up with some quick honorable mentions for decks looking at a higher or a lower budget than this current list. If you're lower on the budget, you may not be playing cards like Nykthos or Valakut, which is no problem. Cycling lands can help out here to keep things flowing just in case of potential top decking late game. Ruby Medallion is also obscenely expensive and not at all required to play mono red. Just slam another mana rock in that slot, like a Star Compass. Don't stress too much about things like medallions. As for Neheb and Fiery Emancipation, which are also over like $20 each, don't sweat those either. I recommend giving a look to Korvat's Fury, which can help out our hand but also burns our enemies' fingers. As for the other, a nice budget card that Torbran will enjoy is the card Daggercaster. You ping everything for 1, which then becomes 3. It's kind of like another version of Goblin Chain Whirler. I just love it. And altogether, those swaps would save over $100 on the price of this deck, so if you're on a lower budget, I hope that those serve you well. On the other hand, if you're instead looking to spruce things up even more, these are just a few cards that I think Torbran might really be interested in. Instead of Spear Spewer, Goblin Sharpshooter looks like it really wants to ping down tons of enemy creatures, or to untap in between an enemy Aristocrat player sacrificing their own creatures. This thing is barrels of fun. And finally, another Torbtastic card that I think our dwarf would really enjoy is Repercussion, which hurts players whenever their creatures are hurt too. The funny thing about this is that if we deal 1 damage to an enemy creature, that will then become 3. So then, when Repercussion deals 3 damage to that enemy, that will become 5. Quite the markup. If we're tuning up this much, I'd say at that point we're probably comfortable losing the Punisher card Risk Factor in exchange. Alright, there we have it, our final list. This is one dwarf our opponents won't ensnare so easily. You can find a link to the list in the description below with the cuts in the maybe board. I hope you've enjoyed this time with Torbran, and if you have any other recommendations that you'd like to leave for your fellow Torbran players, make sure you leave those in the comments below. And if you ever find yourself in the same pot as an elf tribal player, know that you're going into battle side by side with a friend. Thanks so much for watching.